If you were standing on the frozen ground of the Eastern Front, you would hear it long before you saw it, rapid bursts of bullets tearing through the air. You would think it was just an ordinary machine gun, until you felt the ground shake with each powerful shot. You would be shocked to realize it was not an ordinary weapon, but a three-barreled beast, a Soviet machine gun that fired like a machine gun but fired with the force of an anti-aircraft gun. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a game changer. Want to know how the Soviets did it? Let's take a look at how this incredible weapon turned the tide of battle. The war on the Eastern Front had reached a crucial point by the winter of 1941. The Germans had already made significant progress, pushing deep into Soviet territory. Stalingrad was in their sights, and their tanks rumbled across the snow-covered fields with unstoppable momentum. However, the Soviets were not finished yet. They were hurting, certainly, but they still had the determination to fight back. And in the depths of their war machine, a new weapon was quietly taking shape, one that would soon catch the Germans by surprise. The DShK heavy machine gun had been a staple in the Soviet arsenal since the late 1930s. It was a powerful weapon, capable of firing large-caliber rounds at high speeds. But in the Soviet factories, engineers had begun to experiment, trying to make the DShK even more devastating. The result was a weapon, unlike anything the Germans had encountered before, a triple-barrel version of the DShK, mounted together to create a fearsome system of firepower. The first reports of the new weapon reached German soldiers in late 1942. They were bewildered by what they had seen. The German infantry had encountered Soviet machine gun positions before, but nothing like this. The triple-barrel DShK could unleash a constant barrage of fire with the speed of a machine gun and the impact of an anti-aircraft cannon. It was a terrifying combination that struck fear into the hearts of German soldiers. They had not anticipated such a weapon, one that could be set up by a small team of soldiers within a matter of minutes, but could unleash destruction on a massive scale. As the Germans advanced deeper into Soviet territory, they began to realize that this new weapon was something they had to deal with. The triple-barrel DShK was mobile, deadly, and quick. A small group of Soviet soldiers could move through the ruined streets, setting up their weapon with speed and precision, and unleash an overwhelming storm of fire. The machine gun's rate of fire was almost beyond comprehension. It could fire in rapid bursts, creating a continuous stream of bullets that tore through anything in its path. One of the first times the Germans encountered the full fury of the DShK triple-barrel system was during the battle for Stalingrad. In the city's ruins, Soviet forces had set up the weapon in strategic locations, hidden from the German tanks and infantry. As the German forces advanced, they suddenly came under heavy fire. The initial burst was enough to send their soldiers scattering. The Germans had expected resistance, but this was something else. It was as though they had walked into a wall of fire. The sound of the DShK's rapid fire echoed through the streets, and within seconds, German tanks and infantry were under fire from all sides. The Germans had always prided themselves on their tactical superiority, but this weapon threatened to change everything. The DShK triple-barrel was not a weapon of mass destruction, like the tanks or artillery the Germans used, but it was a weapon of sheer volume and speed. The Soviets had managed to take an already powerful machine gun and turn it into a weapon that could hold off an entire German advance. The Germans, not yet fully understanding the weapon's capabilities, were forced to rethink their strategies. Tanks, which had been a central part of their offensive, could be destroyed by the weapon's heavy fire. Infantry units, normally well protected behind their tanks, found themselves exposed and vulnerable. As the war in Stalingrad continued to escalate, so did the use of the triple-barrel DShK. The weapon began to make its way to other fronts, where it was used with devastating effectiveness. It became a tool not just for holding back the Germans, but for counterattacking and taking back lost ground. The Germans were now faced with a problem they hadn't anticipated: the rapid, mobile Soviet infantry, armed with a machine gun that could tear through everything in its path. What made the DShK even more dangerous was its adaptability. The Soviets were able to set it up in almost any terrain, from the ruined cities to the open fields of the steppe. The weapon could be mounted on vehicles, placed in entrenched positions, or even set up on the move, giving the Soviets a level of flexibility that the Germans found difficult to match. The Germans, having focused so much on their tanks and artillery, had neglected the power of small, mobile teams that could quickly deploy this deadly weapon in any situation. The Soviets had not simply created a new weapon. They had crafted a system of defense that was difficult to break. In the early days of the war, the Soviets had been on the defensive, but the triple-barrel DShK marked a shift in the balance of power. It allowed Soviet forces to not just hold their ground but to force the Germans into retreat. As the weapon's reputation spread, the Germans began to fear it, even though they had yet to fully understand it. The story of the DShK triple-barrel system was not just one of technological innovation. It was a symbol of Soviet resilience, a weapon created out of necessity that would go on to become a critical part of their defense strategy. The Germans had come expecting to face a war of tanks and artillery, but they had underestimated the Soviets' ability to innovate and adapt. What started as a small, mobile weapon soon became a terror on the Eastern Front, forcing the Germans into a new kind of war, one they were not prepared for. The Soviet success with the DShK triple barrel was not just a victory of firepower, but a symbol of their ability to turn the tide of the war. With each burst of fire, each set up in a hidden position, they were showing the Germans that the war was far from over. The triple-barrel DShK wasn't just a weapon, it was a message. The Soviets were still fighting, and they weren't about to surrender. In the summer of 1942, the Germans were closing in on their ultimate objective, the city of Stalingrad. After months of brutal fighting, they had made significant advances into Soviet territory. The battle for Stalingrad was a key moment in the war, and the Germans were confident they would soon capture the city. But they didn't know that something unexpected was waiting for them in the ruins of the city, a weapon that would catch them off guard and change the course of the battle. The first real taste of this new Soviet weapon came when German forces pushed forward into the outskirts of Stalingrad. The Wehrmacht had already overcome many Soviet defenses, but they had not encountered anything like this before. As the German infantry advanced, they began to feel a strange tension in the air. It wasn't just the usual danger of snipers and artillery. This was something different, something heavier. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a deafening roar of machine gun fire. The Germans weren't prepared for it. The DShK triple-barrel system was set up in a small, concealed position, hidden among the ruined buildings. The machine gun's high rate of fire created a constant barrage of bullets, each one thudding into the German ranks with shocking force. The fire was so intense that it felt as though the air itself was alive with the sound of gunfire. The Germans had seen heavy machine guns before, but nothing like this. The DShK's rapid burst seemed endless, each pull of the trigger sending a stream of bullets tearing through the German soldiers. The first wave of German infantry was caught completely off guard. The soldiers tried to take cover, but there was nowhere to hide from the sheer volume of fire. German tanks, once a powerful symbol of military superiority, were now vulnerable to this unexpected threat. The Soviets had set up the machine guns in positions where they could fire at both infantry and vehicles. German tanks, which were usually well protected from smaller arms fire, now found themselves under attack from a weapon that could tear through their armor. As the Germans attempted to regroup, they found that the DShK triple-barrel system was not just a single weapon, it was part of a larger, coordinated Soviet defense strategy. The Soviets had become masters at using their terrain to their advantage, setting up the weapon in narrow streets and alleys where the Germans' tanks couldn't maneuver. The Germans were forced to send infantry forward to clear out the Soviet positions, but this only led them into the line of fire. Every time they moved, the machine gun unleashed another wave of fire, cutting down soldiers and leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. The Germans quickly realized that this new weapon was not something they could simply fight with traditional tactics. The DShK triple barrel was more than just a machine gun, it was a symbol of Soviet ingenuity and adaptability. The weapon could be deployed quickly, set up in places where the Germans would never expect it, and unleash devastating fire at a moment's notice. The Germans had focused so much of their strategy on tanks and artillery, But now they were facing a weapon that could neutralize their strength and turn the tide of battle in an instant. As the battle for Stalingrad continued, the Soviets began to understand how to use the DShK triple-barrel system more effectively. They learned to move their teams quickly, setting up the machine guns in different locations to keep the Germans guessing. The Soviets were no longer simply trying to hold back the Germans, they were now on the offensive, using their new weapon to force the Germans into retreat. The Germans, on the other hand, were forced to rethink their tactics. They had underestimated the power of the DShK, and now they had to deal with the consequences. The first real countermeasure the Germans developed was to attempt to outflank the Soviet positions. They tried to send infantry around the sides of the Soviet machine gun nests, but this proved to be a dangerous strategy. The Soviets had set up defensive positions in such a way that any attempt to flank them was met with heavy fire from multiple directions. The Germans tried to bring in more tanks, but the terrain of Stalingrad, with its narrow streets and ruins, made tank movements difficult. The DShK triple barrel's high rate of fire tore through the German vehicles, making it impossible for them to advance without suffering heavy losses. The Germans quickly recognized that the triple barrel system was not just a fleeting threat, it was a new kind of weapon that would require a complete shift in strategy. The shock of encountering such a powerful, mobile weapon sent ripples through the German command. The Soviets had managed to level the playing field, and the Germans could no longer rely solely on their tanks and artillery to win the day. As the days went by, the fighting became even more intense. The Soviets, having discovered the true potential of their new weapon, used it not only in defense but in ambush tactics as well. The Germans, now forced to take extreme caution, began to suffer heavy casualties. The once mighty German army, confident in its ability to crush any resistance, found itself bogged down by a small group of Soviet soldiers armed with a weapon that could shred their ranks in minutes. In the midst of this chaos, the Germans began to understand that the Soviets were not just defending their city, they were fighting for survival. The DShK triple-barrel system was a weapon of desperation, born out of the need to defend their homes and families. And while it was not a weapon of mass destruction, it proved to be one of the most effective tools the Soviets could wield in their fight against the invaders. By the time the Germans had realized the full extent of the threat, it was too late. The battle for Stalingrad had already taken a turn. The Soviets, emboldened by the success of their new weapon, began to push back with increasing force. The Germans had underestimated the power of the triple-barrel DShK, and now they were paying the price. The first encounter with this new weapon had shattered the illusion of German invincibility, marking the beginning of the end for their advance on the Eastern Front. By the fall of 1942, the Germans were beginning to understand the full extent of the threat posed by the Soviet DShK triple-barrel system. The weapon had not only surprised them but also crippled their advances on multiple fronts. The relentless fire from the machine guns, able to tear through tanks and infantry with equal ferocity, had forced the German command to reconsider their strategy in the east. The Soviets had not just created a powerful weapon, they had turned a small, mobile team into a formidable, coordinated threat that could strike anywhere at any time. The DShK triple barrel was no longer just a surprise. It was now a central element of Soviet defense, one that needed to be neutralized if the Germans had any hope of progressing further. In response, the Germans began to adapt. They quickly realized that their traditional tactics, based on heavy artillery and tanks, were not enough to defeat the Soviets' new weapon. A series of new countermeasures were devised to tackle the DShK, but each one presented its own set of challenges. The first attempt to deal with the threat came in the form of heavier artillery bombardments. German commanders ordered concentrated artillery strikes aimed at Soviet machine gun positions, hoping to destroy them before they could do any more damage. While artillery did have some effect, it was not the panacea the Germans had hoped for. The DShK machine guns were often positioned in hard-to-reach areas, such as the ruined buildings and trenches that dotted the landscape of Stalingrad. These positions were difficult to target with artillery, and even when the German shells hit the mark, they didn't always neutralize the weapon. The Soviet soldiers, using their knowledge of the terrain, would simply move the guns to new positions, staying one step ahead of the German bombardment. The Soviets were becoming adept at relocating quickly, setting up in hidden locations, and launching devastating fire before the Germans had a chance to retaliate. The second major German countermeasure was the use of specialized infantry tactics. The Germans attempted to send smaller, more mobile units to flank Soviet positions. These specialized squads would work their way around the Soviet defenses, trying to catch them by surprise. The idea was to hit the Soviet machine gun teams before they could set up their guns, or to approach them from unexpected angles. However, this tactic proved to be equally ineffective. The Soviets, with their superior knowledge of the urban battlefield, had anticipated such moves. The German flanking units would often find themselves trapped in narrow alleyways, with the DShK guns firing from concealed positions on both sides. In these close-quarter battles, the mobility of the German infantry was limited, and the heavy fire from the DShK proved too much to overcome. Realizing that their infantry tactics were not working, the Germans turned to more extreme measures. They began to use their own tanks more aggressively, hoping that their armor would give them the upper hand. Tank crews were ordered to push forward with increased speed and ferocity, attempting to bulldoze through Soviet defenses. However, this strategy faced the same issue as the infantry tactics. The DShK's high rate of fire was able to disable or destroy the tanks before they could make significant headway. German tanks, which had been a symbol of their military power, were now vulnerable to a small, mobile Soviet force armed with nothing more than heavy machine guns. This situation forced the Germans into a deeper level of innovation. Realizing that they could not continue to fight the Soviets using the same strategies, the Wehrmacht started to experiment with new tactics designed to neutralize the DShK. The Germans began to focus on a new type of warfare: psychological tactics. They aimed to disorient and demoralize Soviet soldiers with intense, non-stop bombardments and noise. The idea was to make the Soviets so overwhelmed by the constant barrage of artillery, tanks, and machine gun fire that they would eventually abandon their positions or make mistakes. Despite the heavy bombardments, the Soviets remained resilient. The DShK triple-barrel system, with its rapid fire and high mobility, gave them the upper hand in urban combat. In Stalingrad, where the fighting was most intense, Soviet forces used the DShK as part of a larger defense strategy that focused on hitting the Germans when they were at their most vulnerable. Soviet troops used the gun to surprise German flanking units and infantry squads, always staying ahead of the German bombardments. The Germans were learning the hard way that they couldn't simply rely on firepower to win the war. They needed to adapt to the unpredictable nature of the Eastern Front. As winter set in, and the battle for Stalingrad grew even more desperate, the Germans were forced to change their approach once again. With the temperature dropping, and the terrain becoming even more treacherous, they attempted to implement new tactics suited to the harsh conditions. But the Soviets, emboldened by the success of their new weapon, were becoming more daring. They began to launch counterattacks of their own, using the DShK triple-barrel system to push the Germans back, one position at a time. The balance of power was shifting. By now, the Germans had realized that the DShK triple-barrel was not just a temporary obstacle, it was a key part of the Soviet defense strategy. The weapon was not just a tool of destruction, it had become a symbol of Soviet resilience. As the Soviet forces continued to push back the Germans, the DShK system played an essential role, devastating German infantry and armor alike. The Germans were finding it harder and harder to maintain their ground. Despite the continued adaptations and countermeasures, the Germans were losing ground on the Eastern Front. The DShK triple-barrel system had become a nightmare for them, and it was clear that they were not prepared for this new form of warfare. Each attempt to overcome the Soviets' innovative tactics only led to more losses. The Germans had failed to understand the true power of the Soviet machine gun, and now, they were paying the price. The DShK had proven to be more than just a weapon, it was a key factor in the Soviets' ability to defend their land and turn the tide of the war. The Germans had no choice but to rethink their entire strategy if they wanted any hope of breaking the Soviet resistance. By the winter of 1942, the battle for Stalingrad had reached a critical turning point. The Germans, who had once been so confident in their ability to conquer the city, were now facing a determined Soviet resistance that showed no signs of breaking. The Soviet forces, buoyed by the success of their new weapons, including the DShK triple barrel, had started to push the Germans back. The Wehrmacht, used to dictating the terms of battle, was now struggling to cope with the new Soviet tactics. They had underestimated the Soviets' ability to adapt and innovate, and it was beginning to cost them dearly. The DShK triple barrel had evolved from a surprise weapon into a cornerstone of Soviet defense. No longer just a tool for slowing down the German advance, it had become a symbol of Soviet resilience. The machine gun's devastating firepower, combined with its mobility, allowed Soviet forces to strike at the Germans wherever they were most vulnerable. The Germans were no longer just fighting for control of Stalingrad, they were fighting to hold their ground against a force that was becoming more unpredictable and more powerful by the day. As the Soviets adapted to their new weapon, they began to use it in new and more effective ways. The DShK triple barrel was no longer just deployed in small teams scattered across the battlefield. Instead, it was used in larger, coordinated groups, often in combination with other Soviet units. Infantry squads would move in tandem with the machine guns, creating a near-impenetrable wall of fire that could overwhelm German positions in a matter of seconds. The Germans, who had once been masters of combined arms warfare, were now finding it difficult to respond to this new, highly mobile form of combat. The Soviets quickly realized that the key to success was not simply using the DShK to hold back the Germans, but to use it as a part of a broader strategy of attrition. They began to rely on the machine gun to wear down German forces over time, chipping away at their morale and their strength. Each burst of fire from the DShK was like a blow to the Germans' confidence. The constant pressure was exhausting, and the Germans were beginning to crack under the strain. The Soviets were no longer simply defending their city, they were pushing the Germans to the brink of collapse. The German response to this new form of warfare was mixed. On the one hand, they continued to rely on their heavy artillery and tanks, hoping that their superior firepower would eventually break the Soviet defenses. On the other hand, they began to experiment with new tactics to deal with the DShK threat. One of the most notable changes was the increased use of specialized infantry squads, trained specifically to hunt down and destroy Soviet machine gun positions. These squads, known as assault units, were designed to work quickly and decisively, bypassing Soviet defenses and striking at the heart of their positions. Despite these efforts, the Germans found that the DShK triple barrel was too mobile and too effective to be easily countered. The Soviets had learned to hide their machine guns in the rubble of Stalingrad, using the ruined buildings and trenches to shield their positions from German fire. The Germans, who were used to fighting in open fields and wide spaces, found themselves at a disadvantage in the urban environment. The narrow streets and broken buildings limited their ability to maneuver, and the DShK fire seemed to come from every direction at once. As the winter deepened, the Soviets began to use the DShK, not just in defensive positions, but in offensive operations as well. Soviet commanders began to use the machine guns as a part of larger counterattacks, launching coordinated strikes against the Germans in an effort to recapture lost ground. The DShK became a central part of these attacks, providing the firepower needed to punch through German defenses and create openings for Soviet infantry to exploit. The Germans, already stretched thin, found themselves unable to keep up with the constant pressure. The Soviet use of the DShK was no longer just about defending Stalingrad, it was about forcing the Germans to retreat. The shift in tactics was a major turning point in the battle. The Soviets, once on the defensive, were now on the offensive. The DShK, which had been a surprise weapon just months earlier, had become a central part of their strategy. It was no longer just about holding the line, it was about pushing the Germans back and gaining ground. The Germans, meanwhile, were struggling to adapt. Their attempts to counter the DShK with heavy artillery and specialized infantry had not been successful. The machine gun had proven too effective and too versatile, and the Germans were beginning to realize that they had underestimated the Soviet resolve. In response to the escalating use of the DShK, the Germans began to rely more heavily on air support. They launched repeated bombing raids on Soviet positions, hoping to disrupt the machine gun teams and force them into retreat. However, the Soviets were prepared for this as well. They had learned to disperse their machine gun teams, making it difficult for the Germans to pinpoint and destroy them. The Soviet forces also used camouflage and deception to further hide their positions, making it nearly impossible for German bombers to hit their targets. The Germans, already facing logistical problems and stretched thin across multiple fronts, were now forced to contend with a new kind of warfare, one that was fast, mobile, and relentless. The DShK triple barrel had proven to be more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of Soviet adaptation and innovation, a weapon that could shift the balance of power on the battlefield. The Germans had underestimated its effectiveness, and now they were paying the price. As the battle for Stalingrad raged on, the Soviets continued to use the DShK triple barrel to devastating effect. The Germans, frustrated and outmatched, were beginning to lose their grip on the city. The weapon had become a key part of the Soviet strategy, and it was clear that the Germans had no easy answer to this new form of combat. The Soviets had found a way to turn the tide of the war using speed, firepower, and adaptability to wear down the Germans. The DShK triple barrel had become a symbol of Soviet resistance and a nightmare for the German invaders. By the early months of 1943, the tide of battle on the Eastern Front had shifted dramatically. The Germans, once confident in their ability to crush Soviet resistance, were now reeling from a series of setbacks. The battle for Stalingrad had already taken a heavy toll on their forces, and the Soviets, armed with their newly proven DShK triple-barrel machine guns, were not just holding their ground, they were starting to push the Germans back. What had begun as a defensive struggle had transformed into an all-out war of survival for both sides. For the Germans, the situation was becoming increasingly dire. The DShK triple barrel was no longer just a surprise weapon, it had become a symbol of Soviet strength and determination. The Soviet forces had not only adapted to the new weapon, but had also perfected its use in the harsh conditions of Stalingrad. The machine guns were deployed with devastating accuracy, catching the Germans off guard time and time again. Each burst of fire from the DSK felt like a blow to the Germans' hopes of victory. Tanks and infantry alike were vulnerable to the rapid, sustained fire that seemed to come from every corner of the battlefield. The Germans had already tried several countermeasures, from increased artillery bombardments to specialized infantry tactics, but nothing had proven effective enough to neutralize the Soviet machine gun teams. The DShK triple barrel was too mobile, too powerful, and too difficult to pin down. The Soviets were quick to relocate their positions, setting up in new locations before the Germans had a chance to respond. This made the German forces feel as though they were fighting a losing battle against an enemy that was always one step ahead. With their positions in Stalingrad growing increasingly unstable, the Germans attempted to reinforce their lines. They brought in fresh troops and tried to re-establish a foothold in key areas of the city. But each time they pushed forward, they were met with the brutal power of the DShK. Soviet soldiers would set up their triple-barrel machine guns in strategic locations, cutting down German troops as they advanced. The DShK's devastating firepower was not just a weapon of destruction. It was a psychological weapon, eroding the morale of the German forces. As the battle dragged on, the Germans began to lose more than just ground. They began to lose hope. The Soviets, bolstered by their success with the DShK triple barrel, seemed to be everywhere at once. The Germans were trapped in a constant cycle of advance and retreat, unable to break the Soviet hold on the city. It wasn't just the loss of territory that hurt, they were also losing men at an alarming rate. The Soviets, using their machine guns in combination with other infantry and artillery, were able to force the Germans to retreat from one position to the next. Every time the Germans thought they had gained a foothold, the Soviets would strike back with renewed strength, using the DShK to devastating effect. The Germans, frustrated and increasingly isolated, were also dealing with worsening logistical problems. The harsh winter of 1942 had drained their supplies, and the constant fighting in Stalingrad made resupply even more difficult. As Soviet forces pushed back, the Germans found themselves running low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The DShK triple barrel was becoming not just a tactical obstacle but a symbol of the Germans' failing efforts to maintain their grip on the city. The Soviets, by contrast, had a seemingly endless supply of manpower and resources to draw upon. The relentless Soviet advance, fueled by weapons like the DShK, seemed unstoppable. For the Soviets, the battle was no longer just about defending Stalingrad, it was about survival on a much larger scale. The success of the DShK triple barrel was a key factor in the Soviet ability to turn the tide of the war. With the Germans unable to break through their defenses, the Soviets saw an opportunity to not just hold their ground, but to push the Germans back across the entire Eastern Front. The DShK's ability to stop tanks and infantry in their tracks had become a critical part of the Soviet strategy. It was no longer just about defense, it was about going on the offensive. As the spring of 1943 arrived, the Germans found themselves on the defensive in more ways than one. The Soviets, having successfully held Stalingrad, were now pushing westward, reclaiming territory that the Germans had once held. The DShK triple barrel, along with other Soviet innovations, became a key part of this offensive. The weapon had evolved from a simple machine gun to a powerful tool of attrition, used to slowly wear down the Germans until they had no choice but to retreat. The Germans were left with few options. Their once great fighting machine was crumbling under the pressure of the Soviet counteroffensive. The DShK triple barrel had become a symbol of Soviet defiance and innovation, and it was proving to be more than just a weapon, it was a harbinger of things to come. The Soviets, having learned to fight with speed, mobility, and firepower, were now in control of the battlefield. The Germans, on the other hand, were struggling to keep up with the pace of the war. Their inability to adapt quickly enough to the changing nature of combat was beginning to show. As the Germans pulled back, the Soviets began to retake lost territory. The DShK, which had once been a surprise weapon, had now become a central part of the Soviet war effort. The Germans were forced to retreat, not just from Stalingrad, but from the entire Eastern Front. The battle for survival had turned into a fight for victory, and the Soviets, with their new weapon in hand, were on the winning side. The DShK triple barrel system had proven to be more than just a weapon, it had become a symbol of Soviet resilience and ingenuity. It was a weapon that had not only held off the Germans, but had pushed them back, forcing them into retreat. As the Soviet forces advanced, the Germans could only watch as their once proud army was pushed further and further from the front lines. The DShK had proven to be the turning point in the battle for Stalingrad, and its success marked the beginning of the end for the German invasion of the Soviet Union. By the spring of 1944, the battle on the Eastern Front had reached its climax. The Germans, once dominant in the early years of the war, were now in full retreat. The turning point had come at Stalingrad, where the Soviets, bolstered by their successful use of the DShK triple barrel, had turned the tide against the invaders. The German army was now facing a relentless Soviet offensive, and the DShK had proven itself to be a key factor in the Soviets' resurgence. The Soviet forces had not only regained their territory but had also begun to push westward, reclaiming land that had been lost to the Germans in the early days of the invasion. The DShK triple barrel, once a surprise weapon, was now a symbol of Soviet strength. Its firepower, combined with Soviet strategy, had given the Red Army the edge they needed to press forward. The Germans, on the other hand, were left scrambling, unable to stop the relentless wave of Soviet forces. As the Soviets advanced, they used the DShK triple barrel in new ways, continuing to adapt and refine its use. The weapon had evolved from a simple defensive tool to a symbol of the Soviet offensive machine. It was now an integral part of Soviet tactics, used not only in defense but in large-scale counterattacks. The DShK's rapid, sustained fire was used to break through German lines, creating openings for Soviet infantry and armor to exploit. The Germans, already stretched thin across multiple fronts, found themselves unable to respond effectively. In many ways, the DShK was a reflection of the Soviet strategy as a whole: adaptable, mobile, and relentless. It wasn't just about firepower. It was about overwhelming the enemy with constant pressure. The Germans had underestimated the Soviets, assuming that they could not sustain their resistance. But the Soviets had proved them wrong, not just by holding on, but by turning the tide of war in their favor. The DShK, once seen as an unexpected threat, had become an essential part of the Soviet war effort, and its success had become a symbol of Soviet resilience and determination. As the months passed, the Germans began to lose their grip on Eastern Europe. The Soviet offensive, fueled by the DShK triple barrel and other innovations, had gained unstoppable momentum. The Germans were retreating in disarray, their forces exhausted and demoralized. The Soviets, on the other hand, were gaining strength. They had regained their territory and were now pushing toward Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany. The battle for Berlin was now on the horizon, and the DShK would play a crucial role in the final phase of the war. As the Soviets neared the German capital, the DShK triple barrel continued to wreak havoc on German forces. The weapon had become a symbol of Soviet dominance, a testament to their ability to adapt and overcome. The Germans, once so confident in their military superiority, were now facing a force that had learned from its past mistakes and had turned those lessons into a winning strategy. The DShK was no longer just a weapon, it was a symbol of the Soviet Union's ability to innovate and adapt in the face of overwhelming odds. The Germans, despite their technological advances, had failed to keep pace with the changing nature of warfare. The Soviets, using weapons like the DShK, had proven that they were not only capable of fighting back but of turning the tide in their favor. As the final assault on Berlin began, it was clear that the DShK had been a key factor in the Soviet victory. By the time the Soviets entered Berlin in May of 1945, the war in Europe had come to an end. The Germans, defeated and broken, were forced to surrender. The DShK triple barrel, which had once been a surprise weapon, had played a significant role in the collapse of Nazi Germany. It had helped turn the tide of the war, and had proven to be one of the most effective weapons in the Soviet arsenal. As the war ended, the DShK triple barrel became a symbol of Soviet ingenuity and perseverance. It was a weapon that had started as an experiment but had evolved into a crucial part of the Soviet war effort. It had been used in countless battles, from the early days of Stalingrad to the final push into Berlin. Its impact on the outcome of the war was undeniable, and its success marked a turning point in the history of warfare. The Soviet victory on the Eastern Front was not just the result of superior numbers or brute force, it was the result of innovation and adaptation. The DShK triple barrel, along with other Soviet innovations, had helped the Red Army defeat the Germans and turn the tide of the war. The Soviets had shown that, even in the face of overwhelming odds, they were capable of fighting back and winning. The DShK was a testament to that resilience and determination. As the war ended, the legacy of the DShK triple barrel lived on. It had played a pivotal role in the Soviet victory, and its success had helped to shape the outcome of World War II. The Germans, who had once been so confident in their ability to crush the Soviets, had been forced to retreat in the face of this unexpected weapon. The DShK, once just a small part of the Soviet arsenal, had become a symbol of the Soviet Union's strength and determination, and its impact on the war would not be forgotten.